In 1700, India produced roughly a quarter of everything the world made. Not a quarter of Asia. A quarter of the entire planet's economic output. The Mughal Empire's revenue exceeded the entire treasury of Britain. The city of Surat alone moved more trade than the port of London. And Dhaka's weavers produced a fabric so fine, so translucent, that European traders called it woven air, a cloth you could pull through a finger ring. 150 years later, India was one of the poorest places on earth. That didn't happen by accident. And it didn't happen because of one battle, or one bad king, or one unlucky plague. It happened because of a process so calculated, so patient, so deliberately designed, that it took decades before anyone could name it. Here's what most people don't realize: the British didn't conquer India. India handed itself over, piece by piece, while being told it was receiving a favor. It started with traders. In 1600, a group of London merchants received a royal charter to do business in Asia. The East India Company. They arrived at India's shores not as an army but as supplicants. They paid taxes to local rulers. They sent gifts to the Mughal court. They begged, politely, for permission to build warehouses. The Mughals, presiding over one of the wealthiest empires in human history, looked at these nervous foreigners and found them harmless. Why wouldn't they? The company's entire military force could have been defeated by a single Mughal provincial governor. But the Mughals were already weakening. After Aurangzeb died in 1707, the empire fractured. Regional powers rose to fill the vacuum. And every one of them needed money, weapons, and allies. The company understood this. They stopped being traders and became kingmakers. The Battle of Plassey, 1757. On a rain-soaked field outside Murshidabad, the company's general Robert Clive faced the Nawab of Bengal with a force 3 times smaller. But Clive had already won before a single cannon fired. He had bribed the Nawab's general, Mir Jafar, with promises of the throne. When the battle began, Mir Jafar held his troops back. The Nawab's army collapsed. Bengal, the richest province in all of Asia, fell to a trading company. The real victory wasn't military. It was financial. Within 8 years, the company had extracted what amounts to £2 billion in today's money from Bengal alone, stripping the treasury accumulated over generations. But that was just the beginning. In 1765, the Mughal emperor, desperate and cornered, granted the company the Diwani, the right to collect taxes across Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Overnight, the company was no longer a business. It was a government. One with shareholders in London, and subjects in India. And the tax system they built was unlike anything India had ever seen. Before the company, taxes breathed with the land. A bad harvest meant lower taxes. A drought meant relief. The company replaced it with a fixed demand, permanent settlement, introduced in 1793. A set amount, due every year, regardless of rain or drought or famine. Landowners who couldn't pay had their estates auctioned. Villages that couldn't pay watched their commons seized. The test run of this system had already been catastrophic. The Bengal Famine of 1770. 1 in 3 people in Bengal died. Not 1 in 3 of the poor. 1 in 3. Merchants, farmers, weavers, children. The province lost roughly 10 million people in a single year. And while the bodies were being carried out of villages, the company's tax collectors were still riding in. Grain was available. Ships were loading it into holds. The company exported more rice from Bengal in the famine year than in the year before it. Because grain that could be sold in London was worth more than grain that could save a Bengali child. What the company was doing to Bengal's people, it was simultaneously doing to its industries. Dhaka's weavers had supplied the world for 500 years. The muslin they made was the most valuable textile on earth. Bengal's cotton goods had been flooding European markets for decades. In 1720, Britain was importing Indian textiles and paying for them in silver. Their domestic weavers were complaining to Parliament. Parliament listened. First came the tariffs. Then came the factories of Manchester. British machine-made cotton could be produced at a fraction of the cost of handwoven Indian fabric. And now those British textiles flooded back into India, through Indian ports, under company administration, with Indian roads carrying British goods to Indian customers. The Indian weaver who had once supplied emperors couldn't compete with a machine in Lancashire. Within a generation, hundreds of thousands of weavers were unemployed. A craft that had survived 5 centuries of conquest was ended in 2 decades by a policy decision made in London. India went from the world's largest exporter of finished textiles to its largest importer. Cotton left India raw. It traveled to British factories. It returned as finished cloth. The profit at every stage of that journey went to Britain. This was the architecture of what Dadabhai Naoroji called the drain of wealth. His calculation was simple and devastating. The taxes collected from India paid for Britain's administration of India, including British officials' salaries, the cost of British wars fought on Indian soil, and the profits remitted to London shareholders. India was paying for its own exploitation. Modern economists have tried to put a number on it. The figure that emerges most often, from Economist Utsa Patnaik, is $45 trillion. That's what flowed from India to Britain between 1765 and 1938. To put that in perspective, it's more than 17 times the current GDP of the United Kingdom. And yet, when the revolt came, it was treated as ingratitude. The 1857 uprising began with soldiers and spread to farmers, princes, and ordinary people who had been watching their world dismantled for a century. Rani Lakshmi Bai of Jhansi led cavalry charges personally. Begum Hazrat Mahal held Lucknow against siege. Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal emperor, 82 years old, became the symbolic figurehead of a movement he couldn't fully control. The company's response was without mercy. Villages were burned. Men were tied to the mouths of cannons and shot apart, deliberately chosen as public spectacle to terrify anyone watching. In Delhi, British troops spent 3 days in systematic looting and killing after the city fell. Bahadur Shah Zafar was exiled to Rangoon, where he died in a prison cell, composing poetry. The company was dissolved. The crown took direct control. The machinery of extraction became more sophisticated, more permanent, more invisible. Railways came to India, not to connect Indians to each other, but to move raw materials from mines and farms to ports. Telegraph wires crisscrossed the subcontinent, not to let Indians communicate, but to allow British administrators to coordinate. The infrastructure of a modern state was laid down, and every piece of it was designed to serve the economy of Britain, not of India. Macaulay's education policy, introduced in 1835, finished the work. Its stated goal, Macaulay wrote this openly, without embarrassment, was to produce people, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. People who would internalize the idea that British was better. That Indian languages, Indian mathematics, Indian astronomy, Indian philosophy, all of it was backward, worth discarding. And the famines kept coming. 1876. 1878. 1899. Each one followed the same pattern: drought, reduced harvest, grain leaving through the ports anyway because the export market paid more than starving peasants could afford. 60 million people died in famines during British rule. Not because India ran out of food. Because the food that existed was being priced out of reach of the people who grew it. In 1919, in a walled garden in Amritsar, a British general ordered his soldiers to fire on a crowd that had gathered for a festival. The crowd was unarmed. The exits had been blocked. His men fired for 10 minutes, until the ammunition ran out. The official death toll was 379. Eyewitness accounts suggest it was closer to 1,000. The general was reprimanded. He retired with a pension. What Britain did to India cannot be summarized in a single atrocity or a single policy. It was a system, patient, compounding, mutually reinforcing. Political control made economic extraction possible. Economic extraction made political control necessary. Cultural suppression made both easier to maintain. India's share of world gross domestic product went from 25% in 1700 to under 4% by 1947. The country that was once so wealthy that Europeans risked months at sea just for the chance to trade with it ended British rule with a life expectancy of 32 years and a literacy rate below 15%. In 1947, when the British left, they took with them 2 centuries of compounded interest on $45 trillion. They left behind borders drawn in 6 weeks by a man who had never been to India, dividing a subcontinent in ways that would generate conflicts for generations. What they also left behind, and this is the part the history books rarely pause on, was a country that had somehow not broken. Despite 200 years of systematic impoverishment, India's social structures, its languages, its knowledge traditions survived, not intact. Nothing survives colonialism intact, but recognizable. Every empire in history has told itself it was civilizing someone. None of them ever asked the people being civilized whether they agreed. If this history is new to you, there's a reason for that. And it's worth asking why. Subscribe, and we'll keep asking.